Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you've ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. Since 2009, our radio program hosted guest experts from around the globe sharing their perspectives, experiences, and expertise while giving you food for thought. If you can't listen live, then download and listen to any of our 300-plus podcasts in our library at texasconflictcoach.com. So sit back, relax, or join the conversation every Tuesday evening, or tweet us at TXConflictCoach.
So why is there so much unresolved and destructive conflict? Why is it so hard for you to come to the table to talk about the conflict you have with someone? So in our episode for the month of June, Conflict Talk, a roadmap for how to get to the table, I will be joined by Karmit Bulman. She is the Executive Director of the Conflict Resolution Center in Minnesota and the author of the Conflict Resolution Process, a Consultant's Handbook. Now, Karmit will help us understand what happens to us in our brains that build a barrier to these uncomfortable situations. Through her storytelling, Karmit will share examples and educate you about a method she developed to work one-on-one with individuals. This three-part roadmap is also a guide for skill building and action planning. With this in mind, Karmit will share her top 3 tips you can use immediately in dealing with your situation. Now, Karmit Bulman, that's spelled B-U-L-M-A-N, is also an attorney, qualified neutral, and an adjunct professor of law at the University of Minnesota School of Law. And her work has involved facilitation of collaborative processes, conflict assessment, coalition building, executive coaching and consulting, new business development, organizational turnaround, revenue expansion, all kinds of things around legislative and policy development. So a huge spectrum of expertise and experience. We are taking live callers' questions and comments, and we can do that in a variety of ways. I already see that we have some guests in our chat room, so welcome to our chat room. Please leave your comments and questions there. We encourage that. You can also call in directly at 347-324-3591 and select number 1 if you have a comment or question for Karmit. Or you can join our Twitter feed. We are running a live Twitter feed tonight, and we're using the hashtag TCC for Texas Conflict Coach Radio, TCC Radio. So, Karmit, welcome to our program.
Thank you so much, Patty. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, you know, this month of June, our series is around conflict mastery, conflict intelligence, conflict competence. In other words, how do we, as people, I mean, a lot of us are practitioners in the field, and we have a lot of guests who share their expertise, but this is really about how do we, arm our listeners to be masters of how they engage in conflict. So I'm so excited that you're going to be able to share some of your experience in this 3-part roadmap. So, in your bio, there's a huge spectrum of experience, expertise that you provide. And so as the Executive Director of the Conflict Resolution Center, why don't you talk a little bit about what the spectrum of services are that you provide to help the audience understand what you do?
Sure, Patty. So we provide alternatives to the traditional way that people resolve conflict in our world. So instead of turning to the police or the courts, attorneys, or getting an ulcer, we encourage people to talk to one another. And so we facilitate processes that allow people to engage in conversations that are peaceful and that are productive and allow people to move forward in their lives. So whether that be landlord-tenant situations, business situations where people owe one another money, neighbor-to-neighbor conflicts, family and interpersonal relationship conflicts, work-related conflicts, discrimination, issues involving children, or even first-time offenders, we bring people together to create what we called consensus-based decision-making. So instead of having an outside authority tell people what to do, we provide services that enable people to come up with their own solutions in an effective and sustainable manner. And we also have a program called conflict consulting, and that is something that I'm going to be talking about this evening. So what we're really hoping to do, and what I'm thrilled that this radio talk show is all about, is change the paradigm that we live in our world, in which people address conflict in what is actually a pretty harmful way. Either we avoid it, or we allow it to build up so much to a point where we resort to violence, or we make other people wrong and we ask our judicial system to step in and decide who's wrong and who's right. And the reality is that none of these methods are really satisfactory or sustainable. And study after study show that when people resolve conflict themselves, they are most likely to gain the kind of satisfaction that they're looking for, and any agreement that they reach is likely to be upheld by the other party, much more so than when an outside authority tells you what to do. So that's in a nutshell what we do at the Conflict Resolution Center here in Minneapolis. There are programs like ours all across the country. There are about 400 community mediation programs in the United States. And we are all working to change the paradigm and to make talking to one another the default instead of the alternative.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that. I know in the past we've had the National Association of Community Mediation on the program, and that is a nice also connection to those 400 community mediation centers that you were talking about. Now, on a personal note, Karmit, what drives you to help others in conflict?
What drives me is being witness to the magic that occurs in mediation. So typically when people walk into a mediation session, they are nervous, they're tense, they're hopeless, they're feeling stuck. And during what is usually about a 2-hour session, there is a transformation that occurs. And people tend to walk out feeling hopeful again, feeling relieved, feeling kind of a new lease on life. So what drives me in the work I do is watching that magic that happens to people. And people time and again walk into a conflict resolution process thinking it's hopeless, and this is something that has consumed them for so long. And at the end of one of our processes, they say, I can't believe the difference this made. So that really drives the work that I do, just seeing that magic. And, hoping that people will take the step of moving forward and using an alternative method of conflict resolution.
Oh, great. I appreciate that. I love what you said about, kind of witnessing that magic. So let's get right down to it. From your experience, why do you believe there is so much conflict, and why can't people come to the table to talk? Because this is what we're talking about, changing this paradigm. So why can't they?
Well, there actually is something that happens to people in conflict in terms of their physiology. So that I think the brain physiology is part of the reason it's so difficult to come to the table. So in our brain, we actually have the sympathetic nervous system, which is kind of our fight or flight system. And what happens in our brain is we react as if we are truly in danger for our lives when we're in conflict. And typically we want to run away from that, or perhaps we want to fight. And so actually, if any of us think about what happens at a time when we're in conflict, our brain is functioning in high alert. It's as if we want to, all the blood flows away from certain organs and to our muscles, our heart, and our lungs, and we actually, feel like we need to run or we need to fight. So that's what's happening for us when we're in conflict. So why would we want to sit at the table with someone who is causing that sort of stress to us? And so that's why it's really difficult. There actually is, we actually call it the part of our brain that is more rational and more reasonable just leaves us for a while. And we call it amygdala hijacking. That emotional part of our brain just hijacks the rest of our brain. And we're really at a place where we feel like there's no possibility we're going to resolve this. So all we do is run away from it or fight for our lives. So that's part of the reason it's so difficult to come to the table. We're not at our most reasonable when we're in a stressful conflict situation.
And yet it's very interesting, the dynamic of our brain is in survival mode, however we perceive those threats, right? And so if we do fight or flight, and there's a tendency to do one or the other, it just adds to the conflict that we're trying to avoid or that we're trying to, fend off. And so there was another element to that question, which is why is there so much conflict? How is that tied in your mind to the neuroscience piece, or maybe there's another element about why there's so much conflict?
Well, conflict is the most pervasive aspect of the human experience. So it's not something we're going to get away from. It's part of who we are as thinking beings. And part of that has to do with we tend to have beliefs and values and notions of what we think is right and wrong. Conflict only happens when we care about something. If we didn't care, there wouldn't be conflict. So the fact that we as human beings care, we have values, we have things that we hold near and dear to our heart, and then we have our thoughts and our feelings. And what happens is if a situation arises that bumps up against our values, we find ourselves in a conflicted situation. And what we often will do is believe that that other person has different values than we have, that somehow they are the other. And once they're the other, they become the enemy. And it's very hard for us to see their perspective, to see that they have any values or any beliefs that could be as strong as those that we have ourselves. And so the conflict tends to escalate. And what seems to happen is that most people don't nip it in the bud as soon as they begin to experience sort of that tension that we all know what it is. You can't quite put your finger on it, but there's something wrong between you and another person. If we could address the conflict at that early stage, we would do so much better than to allow it to get to a point where we really feel like we could resort to blows. And I actually have an example of somebody whose neighbor was just absolutely driving them crazy. There was just too much noise next door, parties, smoke was coming into their bedroom and they were trying to sleep. The scents from the laundry detergent was actually coming into the house, quite sensitive to that. And so the person just kept coming home and feeling like they were stuck in their own home, like they were prisoner in their home. The place that's supposed to be that place of sanctity and peacefulness was turning into a place of strife. And they got to a point where they knocked on their neighbor's door and said, this has to stop. Here are the things I need you to do in order for me to have peaceful home life. And what do you think happened? The neighbor slammed the door on their face. Because by the time they came there, they were so upset that all the neighbor could hear was all this angst. So we actually had this person come into us for conflict consulting, and I don't know if you want to start talking about that.
Yes, go ahead.
So you can see how the recommendation is that as soon as you're starting to feel that tension with your neighbor, I know it feels real good to vent to your friends and everybody about what horrible situation you have with your neighbor, But what if instead you met with someone who was trained, and that's our conflict consulting program, and that person gave you an opportunity to talk about what's going on. So that's the first stage of conflict consulting, to really have some time to emote and vent a little bit about the situation that's really causing a lot of upset. And there really are studies that show that we need to do some of that emotional release. We as human beings have emotions. No matter how much we try to hide from them, they are there. So we need an opportunity to talk about the impact an emotional situation is having on us and to do some emotional release. And it's frequently a lot better to do that with an impartial third party, to get some of that angst out before you're actually going to speak to the person. Chances are if you have all that angst and you lay that all on the other person, they're not really going to want to talk to you. So the first stage of conflict consulting is being able to talk to someone who's there to really listen to you and to validate your experience and to listen actively. The second stage in conflict consulting is an opportunity to learn some skills, and I'd love to share some of those skills with you tonight. And then to do some rehearsing with the conflict consultant about how they're actually going to address this conflict with the person that they have the issue with. And then the final stage is coming up with an action plan for what you're going to do to address the situation. So, and it's actually in writing. You can walk away with a written action plan, and then you certainly can come back for follow-up sessions to see whether that action plan really worked or not. So that's our three-stage process. And people, when they go through the conflict resolution process with us through a conflict consulting session, tend to feel much more hopeful that they've got a constructive plan, and they've also had some time to release some of the emotions and to recognize that they may not know what's going on with the other person. They may have been doing a lot of speculating and a lot of guessing, and they perhaps might have an opportunity to have what we call a courageous conversation with the other person. So one of the skills I want to impart to the listeners this evening is you can have a courageous conversation. There are ways to have a conversation with someone where both of you win, where you let go of the blaming and the shaming and the righteousness that we often have when we're upset with somebody. And probably the best tip I can give about courageous conversations is, if you solve the other person's problem, you solve your own. Now, it sounds easier than it actually is, but believe it or not, the person you're in conflict with probably doesn't like this situation any better than you do. And if you will allow yourself to truly be a good listener, to try to understand the other person's perspective, to understand that that person also has some needs, some values, some beliefs, and that if you work with them to understand where they're coming from, the miracle will happen to you that you will actually solve your own problem. So there are many steps to getting there. I don't mean to oversimplify it at all, but in a well-construed conflict consulting session, it is really possible for you to figure out how to have a courageous conversation and to solve the other person's problem and therefore to solve your own. So courageous conversation is one of the skills I wanted to teach.
Okay. So hold on just a second. So because I want to
Sure.
just check in with our listeners. We've got a number of people in the chat room and in our studio. So you are tuned in to the Texas Conflict Coach Blog Talk Radio program, and we are talking with Karmit Bulman of the Conflict Resolution Center in Minnesota. And what we've gotten into really targeting here is this three-part roadmap that Karmit has developed called conflict consulting. And before we get into any further skills and strategies, which will be important, is to clarify two things. One is what is the motivation for developing this particular method? Because you provide a real broad spectrum of processes, including mediation, and you also cover a broad spectrum of types of disputes and people that might come through your door. So the first is really kind of what motivated that. And second, clarify for listeners, how is conflict consulting the same or different from conflict coaching? Because people hear a lot about that. So there you go. You take whichever one you want to go with first.
Okay, thanks, Patty. The reason we developed the conflict consulting program is because people frequently call us up or arrive at mediation and find that the other party either isn't there or won't come, or they've assumed that the other person won't come to the table. And it's an opportunity to meet with someone trained to figure out how to get them to the table, or perhaps you're not ready to meet with them, but you really want to figure out what you want to do about this particular conflict. So we developed the program because it is difficult to get somebody that you're in conflict with to come to the table. And so that it's kind of a step one. And frequently people go through conflict consulting and then they have that courageous conversation, or they have mediation and they decide, yeah, I can do this now that I've got a lot more clarity and I've learned some skills. How does this different than conflict coaching? Conflict consulting is a method of conflict coaching. It's a design that we created here at the Conflict Resolution Center. It's really based on a particular conflict that you have with a particular person or set of people. It's not based on, having ongoing conflict in your life with many different people. And so it's meant to address something that's very specific. You've got a neighbor that, you consider the neighbor from hell, excuse the expression, or you are having problems with your landlord, or somebody owes you money, or you have a family member that everything is just broken down with them. So it's a specific problem with a specific person or set of people. And the consultation is really pretty structured. So if it's our brand, our form, and we don't call it coaching because the session ends after we don't work with people more than 4 sessions. And we don't really coach. We really help the person come up with their solutions. It's very much like mediation, where the agenda is created by the person who's in conflict, and they come up with their own solutions. We may teach them some skills, but we're taking all of our cues and our directions from the person actually in conflict. So I hope that clarifies, our brand of conflict.
Absolutely. Thank you for doing that. So one of the things that you already gave as a tip for having these courageous conversations that you might be preparing, that might be one of the action steps that they have in your 3rd stage. And the tip you gave was if you solve the other person's problem, you solve your own. And like you said, it's simplified the tip, but there's a lot of things that come to it. What other skills or strategies did you want to bring to the conversation now?
Yeah, so one of the other things is people have often hear about I statements, a statement, starting with I. And unfortunately, people sometimes think that I statement is basically any statement you make that starts with I. So, for example, you could say, I feel like hitting you. And you would think that that's an I statement. So, no, it's really not. And so I really want, and we spend some time in conflict consulting helping people understand what an I statement is. What it really is an opportunity for you to talk about how you feel when there is a specific situation that happens, that another person does, or a situation you find yourself in, and then explaining why you feel that way and what you might like to have happen in the future. So, for example, if your neighbor played loud music until 2 o'clock in the morning, You might be inclined to knock on their door and say, "You are such a lousy neighbor. You only care about yourself. Now turn your music down." So that might be a typical response when somebody is fed up with loud music from a neighbor. An I statement would be something like, "I feel really scared when I hear loud music coming from upstairs, because I'm afraid I won't sleep well, and sleep is really essential to my good health. And so I'm wondering if we could work out an arrangement where there's a time where you turn your music down or some alternative so that I could sleep well at night." So that is an I statement. It's not blaming, it's not name-calling, it's focusing on the behavior and not on the person, and it's allowing the person to relate to me and my need for something like good sleep, which is something that people can relate to. So people often really need to practice those I statements because they go back to, "I feel like calling the police when your music is loud," and that's really not an I statement, nor is that really a feeling. So,
for whatever reason, over time, for us who practice this time and becomes natural to us, I don't know about you, but I, in working with groups, individuals, or whatever, get some of the most resistance of people learning how to use I statements. It is so unnatural for them, for a lot of people, because they're so used to using you. How do you get them to break through that resistance? And part of it is just understanding it, but sometimes it's like, "Oh, I don't talk that way. I never talk that way. I don't know that I would ever be able to do an I statement." How do you address that with them?
Well, what I do is basically say, just practice it for a while with me. I'll have them practice right with me in a conflict consulting session. And yes, it feels formulaic and it feels awkward. If you practice it enough, when you actually do it, it comes from your heart and it doesn't feel formulaic. So I can give an example from my own life. When I come home at the end of the day, and my teenagers, especially in the summer, have been laying around the house all day, and there's a sink full of dishes, I started out by saying to them, "You guys get off the couch, turn the TV off, and come do the dishes." I didn't even say hello to them, So that was, and here I am, a great conflict resolver, and I have done this with my teenagers in the past. One day, I came home, saw the dishes in the sink, and the kids had been pretty much on break all day. I went over and I said, "Hey guys, what you watching?" And I said to them, "You know what, guys? I've had a really long day, and it's real hard for me to come home to a sink full of dishes. It's just, it's part of my sort of needing to feel the serenity of being at home. So I wonder if we could just make a deal that if you're home all day, by 4 o'clock, you'll get the dishes done." And they each looked at me and they said, "Sure, Mom." And that was the end of it. And after that, the dishes just were done. So, my kids were kind of more accustomed to me doing the, "Hey, kids, get off the couch, turn off the TV, come do the dishes" kind of mom. Mm-hmm. But when I changed it, they were so appreciative, they did not even notice, and things changed in our relationship. So you would be surprised how much an altering of the way you speak to people using I statements can actually change the entire relationship and the way you live together, the way you are together.
Well, and that's part of changing that paradigm, of how do you start to begin to address those tensions or potential conflict, even just by simply using the technique of using I statements that take away that blaming, shaming, kind of behavior that we do. Now, as we begin to start to wrap up our session tonight, is there another strategy or tip that you have before we go into our call to action?
Well, yeah. I mean, the other one, again, all of these it takes a long time to learn them. We did not grow up with anybody teaching us really good conflict resolution skills or good active listening skills. And I would say that active listening is the world's most powerful skill. And it's the one that we will never be good enough at. No matter how much we practice, we got to keep practicing our whole lives. And active listening really means you are listening for some of the needs that the person who is speaking to you have, some of their values, and their feelings. So when you're active listening, you're not just reflecting back to them, the facts of what you heard. The facts aren't as important as what are some of the feelings and the values that underlie what somebody has said to you. So if somebody says something to you like, I'll go back to you're a lousy neighbor and you care only about yourself. If somebody said to me, my neighbor is so lousy and they only care about themselves, active listening would be reflecting back, so you really value having a good relationship with your neighbor and having somebody who cooperates with you. So that way, I'm not only stating back to them what they said to me, I'm stating back the values underneath it, that they value a good relationship. I might also state back, and it sounds like you're frustrated by this situation. And that helps them to really clarify. Or they might say, no, I'm not frustrated, I'm angry. And it'd be great because it helps them clarify what emotion that they've got around the situation. So I'd say the third skill is really solid active listening and investing the time and really learning how to do that and just practicing it in your everyday life.
Well, I'm glad that's something that is part of your, as you talked about the three-step roadmap, part of that skill building and teaching them active listening, using I statements, for example, that they get to rehearse that with you so that they can carry that forward and that they have that tangible, concrete way of actually applying that in their real specific dispute that you're helping them with. So given that, you've given a number of strategies and tips, and again, takes practice. A lot of times we think, oh, that's easy. When I get into conflict, I'll use an I statement. Not unless you practice it and you're ready.
Brain is hijacked and we forget what an I statement is.
That's exactly right, because that amygdala hijack. So yes, we have to be prepared for that and really practice that. So we usually give the listeners a call to action, hang up the phone, and they're like, what's the thing that they need to do? And all good coaching, consulting, we usually give some kind of field work, like that action planning you were talking about. So what do you have for our listeners to take away and immediately begin practicing?
So I'd like to give listeners the kind of template for I statements and to ask you to really practice them, even, if it feels kind of formulaic at first. So you could talk back to the TV instead of talking to a real person so that you practiced enough. I listen to Gossip Girls or what's that other one, America's Best Top Model. And when they say really sort of inflammatory things that drive me crazy, I practice reflecting back with a good active I statement to them, just so I keep my skills nice and sharp. But, the template is I feel, and then put in a feeling, when, and then put in whatever the situation is in a non-blaming way. So I feel blank when such and such happens, loud music, dirty laundry, dirty dishes, whatever it is, because why do you feel that way? And then what would you like for the future? So I feel blank when blank happens because blank, and I would like for this to happen in the future. So that is the template for an I statement, and I would ask listeners to give it a try. Try dealing with a common conflict you have, such as dishes or taking the garbage out, and use an I statement and see if things don't change in that relationship with that person you've made the statements to.
You know, it's interesting because sometimes people get caught up when they're first learning this with the statement, I feel frustrated when the dishes aren't done because you're really a jerk. No, you know, so just make sure that they don't insert that, you know, then, you know, because you are, because it's essentially doing the same thing with the you statement. So just be careful with that second element, folks, when you're practicing that. It's funny, I wrote in the chat room when you're talking about watching Gossip Girls or the Top Model or whatever. It's like there's so many reality TV shows now that there's so much conflict on those shows. It's just right for practicing I statements or listening deeply, you know, for what those needs are.
Yep.
All right, so now, so there are a couple of things. First of all, folks can find your information. Where could they best get a hold of you and find out information about your book?
Well, they can go to our website, www.crcminnesota.org.
And that's CRC Minnesota, and that's MINNESOTA.org for those who are spelling challenged. And they can also email you where?
Yeah, it's Karmit. It's Karmit at CRC Minnesota, again spelled out, MINNESOTA.org. So
okay.
Karmit, crcminnesota.org.
And then the book, which is the book Conflict Resolution Process, a Consultant's Handbook, is based on the conflict consulting method that you've created. Now, is this something that if someone wanted to learn about conflict consulting, they would learn it through this Consultant's Handbook, and or do you do trainings to train others on how to do conflict consulting?
Both. We do a training at least once a year on conflict consulting, and people also purchase the book from our website and read it and use the skills that they learn in the book in addressing conflicts that they have in their professional lives or personal lives. So either way, we also travel around the country and do some national presentations on conflict consulting, and we're available to do that as well.
Okay, so I'm glad you made the point about the book that it's, even though it says a consultant's handbook, it's not just aimed for practitioners, but really individuals that are learning how to deal with conflict themselves would definitely find benefit and use in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually have an example. I left it on my mother's coffee table, and the person who takes care of my older mother picked it up and asked if she could borrow it to help her with a conflict she's having with her daughter. So, yeah, it's really an easy-to-read book, pretty self-explanatory in plain English, so really anybody can pick up the book and use it. And if they want to be trained as a conflict consultant, they can contact us, and we'll take it from there.
Okay, that is wonderful. So, Karmit, thank you so much for kicking off our series this month and being with us. And what final message do you want to leave with our listeners tonight?
Well, I want to leave the message that you should, if you've got conflict in your life, which if you are human, you do, pay some attention to whether if you solve the other person's problem, you might be able to solve your own. So that
I love that.
And thank you so much for the time today. I appreciate sharing with everybody, and I hope that people will take some of the things that I talked about to heart.
Well, great, Karmit. Thank you again so much for that last tip. Thank you, listeners, for being in the chat room and in our studio and in our Twitter feed, and we will see you next Tuesday. And Karmit, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you've enjoyed the program. You can find over 300 podcasts archived to listen at your own convenience at texasconflictcoach.com or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. To learn about upcoming radio programs and resources, sign up for our monthly e-newsletter.